trumpets to open it. Da, 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 da. Sitting here with Mr. Eckhart Tolle. Can I say Eckhart?
Yes, everybody calls me Eckhart.
Why is that?
That's my name.
That's the name they gave you.
That's the name that came to me a few years after I went through this inner transformation. I had a dream, and in that dream I saw on a table a pile of books, and the books had the name Eckhart on them. And at that time I didn't have the name Eckhart, but I knew in the dream that I had written these books. And at that time I hadn't written any books, and I wasn't planning to write any books. And so I thought, well, that's a strange dream. And a few days later I was walking. At that time I was living in Glastonbury, England. I was walking down the high street and somebody stopped me, an acquaintance of mine, and he was a psychic. Many psychics live in Glastonbury. And he said, "Oh, hi, Eckhart." And I said, "Why did you call me Eckhart?" He said, "I don't know, it just came out of my mouth." So these two things combined, the dream plus the fact that this psychic called me Eckhart without knowing why, and the fact that I already felt that I was not the person that I was before. I had gone through the shift in consciousness, and the old name was carrying so much past with it that I felt it's time to let go of that. So it was a message to me. A secondary consideration was that I admired deeply the writings of Meister Eckhart, the mystic who lived in, I think, the 12th century, 13th century.
But Eckhart is not who you are.
Oh no, it's just a name. No name is who I am or who you are. So it's just a conventional form, and it just corresponds a little bit more to the inner reality than the previous name, but it's not who I am at all.
Could you put a label on what you really are?
No, the essence of who we are is ultimately formless and timeless, and you cannot label it. The moment you label it, you have reduced it to something. And so I believe that's what is meant in the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, where it says the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So the moment you attach a name to it, you've given the formless form. And by giving it form, you have reduced it immediately. Now the Buddha, for example, he knew that. So of course he also knew he had to speak to reach people. So what do? The moment you utter a word, you have reduced the ultimate reality to something that it isn't, something small. So very cleverly, the Buddha used certain words that have an openness to them, words such as emptiness or nirvana, nothingness, or the unmanifested, the unborn. So those words, they are still words, but they are so open that those are actually the most adequate words to convey something that really cannot be conveyed in words. So I really admire the Buddha for that. And of course that didn't prevent people a few hundred years later from transforming the Buddha himself into a kind of God.
Ja. Kun je anders even boven checken? Yeah. It's a little bit noisy.
Yes, maybe you can say something to them. You're going to say something?
Yeah, just
yes.
They could be still for now.
Yes.
Noise can be nice, but...
Yes, maybe not on the radio.
Yeah, people think, what's going on? Are they building something there? Yeah. So do you ever listen to the radio?
Yes, I listen. I have a satellite radio at home, and I listen occasionally to a music station, and I listen every day to the news, the BBC World Service news, because the North American news, American and Canadian news are very limited. Yeah. So I love the BBC World Service, so once a day I listen to an hour of that, and they have a music channel that is called Spa, that has very pleasant kind of new age and spiritual music.
Okay. So no German polka music for you?
No.
Or classical music?
Occasionally I listen to classical also, but not that much.
Okay. Yesterday during the talk, you mentioned the movie The Matrix.
Yes.
Can you tell something more about that? Do people live in a matrix kind of surrounding?
Yes, the basic message, the underlying the matrix, is that what humans conceive to be reality, their daily life and so on, is ultimately a kind of dreamlike existence. And another part of that message is that it is possible to wake up out of that dreamlike existence. And perhaps that explains the success of that movie, because deep down, perhaps there is a realization in people that there is a truth there. And so, of course, it's not quite as it is shown in the film. I'm not saying that we are being controlled by machines, but what we are being controlled by is our own minds that is totally conditioned by the past. Our minds with the continuous mental noise, the compulsion to think continuously and to identify with every thought that comes, that's the dreamlike state. And most people walk in that, where they talk to themselves with that inner voice, which is the thought processes, continuously, and interpret everything through that veil of the inner voice. Everything gets distorted through that. So they're hardly aware ever of the present moment, of the aliveness of life around them, because they are too immersed in that dream world in their head, which is their identity. They derive their sense of self from that continuous self-talk in the head. So that's the state that reduces life to something very narrow, and existence you become reduced to a little person with a little personal history, not knowing your true reality, how wonderful a life and how vast life can actually be when you transcend this limited, personalized sense of self. And that's, of course, what all the ancient teachers already pointed to. The Buddha talked about the unreality of the self. That's the very essence of the teaching of the Buddha. Jesus said, deny thyself. And of course, in churches, they won't be able to explain to you what he really meant by that, because they can't live it. They don't see the truth of it. But deny thyself, of course, implies that the self is not real. It would be absurd to say deny thyself if the self that you think you are is real, then you can't deny what's real. But when Jesus says deny thyself, it implies it's an illusion. So what you deny is the illusion, and denying means to look beyond that, to see beyond it, and so to transcend that self. That's the basic message of all spiritual teachings. And the strange thing is, people seem to have forgotten it, or only few individuals ever got it here and there over the centuries. Now, for the first time, more people are open to this, not to just intellectually recognize the truth, but actually experience the truth of that.
Feel it.
Yes.
But if you say deny thyself, the false self, who is it which is making who is making the decisions?
Yes, good question. So if I say, if I may extend your question, if we say identifying with thoughts, we tend to continuously identify with our thoughts. So if I identify with my thoughts, who am I? I think it's part of your question too. If I am not the thoughts that arise in my mind, that tell me this or that about other people and myself and so on, who or what is it that identifies with thoughts? Now, no thought could be there without consciousness. Consciousness is the light in which the thought forms appear. So for any thought to be there, there must be the light of consciousness in which the thought appears, otherwise there could be no thought. So who you are in essence is the light of consciousness behind the thought, so to speak. And you can find that in yourself if you become aware, for example, of the space between two thoughts. So inner space, I sometimes call it. Another word for it is inner stillness. You can actually sense then that there is a space inside you that is free of noise, in fact, free of any form. For example, now, if I stop speaking now, this may not be generally acceptable on the radio, but I'm going to stop speaking now for about 4 or 5 seconds. That I think we can tolerate that. I'll stop speaking for 4 or 5 seconds and see if you, the listener, can be just alert and present in that space without believing that you have to fill that space with some kind of thought. Something that might help, before I do that, is while there is that little space of 4 or 5 seconds, if you can feel the inner body, which is the aliveness in the energy field of your body, your hands, your arms, your legs, that is undoubtedly there, but most people can't feel that because they're always in the head thinking. So it helps to stay free of thought and just be present when you can at the same time feel the inner energy field of your body. Is it alive or not? Oh, yes, it's alive. So I'll stop speaking for a few seconds and see if you can, during those 5 seconds, just be here, not as a person who has to think, but just as a conscious presence, formless, now. Okay, you're still here. You haven't disappeared.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exercise. So we could say Descartes was wrong. I think, therefore I am.
Yes, he was of course he was searching for some kind of certainty, because he could see that many things that we take for real can be questioned. He already saw, because he came at the end of the Middle Ages, he already saw that many of the basic assumptions that people had never questioned certainly were simple beliefs. Nobody could really see that were real or not. So he said, what is it that I can be absolutely certain of? And he looked around and he said, well, even sense perceptions, I may not be seeing what is actually there. Maybe I'm distorting and of course that's very true. The world may not be how we perceive it, because how we perceive depends on our sensory organs. They reduce everything and maybe distort it. And then finally he looked within and said, oh, one thing that I'm actually always doing is thinking. So he was going in the right direction, but he stopped too soon. If he had gone a little bit further and deeper into himself, he would have seen that thinking requires the light of consciousness. Without that, there is no thinking. But consciousness itself is much vaster than any thinking. It's prior to thinking. But he stopped with thinking. If he had gone a little bit deeper into himself and then realized, I am conscious, therefore I am, that would have been more true. Although I would have verbalized it even differently. It was, I am consciousness rather than I am conscious. Because if you say I am conscious, you have two things. You have I and conscious. But the truth, of course, is that who I essentially am is consciousness itself. That's the essence of my identity. So people usually think their identity is their personal history, which is thought forms in the head. But what is it that gives life to these thought forms? The light of consciousness. And most people get their sense of self from their personal identity. But if you really look deeply, what is it when you feel that you are yourself? And if you look deeply into your sense of self, you actually realize it's not ultimately your story. It's the light that shines through the story, which is consciousness. So that's where really the self lies, what in India is called the Atman, which is sometimes translated as the divine within, and which the Buddhists call emptiness, because it's formless. They're talking about the same thing, or no thing. Then you realize that frees you from the illusion that all you are is that little me in the head that never stops talking until finally you die.
Or fall asleep.
Yes. Or have a few stiff drinks.
Yeah, or other substances.
Yes.
Why is it that people hold on to painful thoughts a lot? Does that reinforce that false sense of self the most?
Yes. Painful thoughts have actually better in reinforcing the false sense of self than pleasant thoughts. Also, any kind of negative thoughts strengthen the ego, the false sense of self, much more than a positive thought, because with a positive thought you become more open. The boundaries are less dense, less rigid. But the moment you think negative thoughts about situations, other people's, or even about yourself, the mind-made self, the sense of me as against the other gets strengthened. So the unconscious egoic mind loves to indulge in negative thinking. You can observe that in yourself, because if there's a pleasant event, let's say yesterday you saw a beautiful sunset, the mind can't do that much with it. It can say, well, that was a beautiful sunset. But if yesterday some other person did something that irritated me, I can spend several hours thinking about that and what he did and what I said or could have said or should have said. And you can amplify that in your mind and derive a lot of egoic satisfaction from it. But it's so to the ego, it feels actually pleasurable to indulge in negative thinking. But of course, it's not really pleasurable, because if you looked into your body and could see what negative thinking does to your body, you would see that it's quite harmful. It interferes with the energy flow in the body. It affects, even mainstream medicine now recognizes that there is a relationship between your thinking, your inner states, and your physiology.
You see it in people's faces with the wrinkles.
Oh yes, you see in people's faces and you can see people who are very much absorbed in their thinking. Also, there's not much light anymore in their eyes, because the entire consciousness is absorbed continuously by largely useless thinking.
And rejecting life as it is.
Rejecting life, not being able to see the richness of life, not being able to experience life in its fullness, the abundance of life. To experience the abundance of life, you don't have to be rich. You can just look around you and see so many life forms continuously dancing around you in the form of nature and other human beings and life, whether you're in a city or out in the country, it doesn't matter. Life is rich, forms of life everywhere, and not to enjoy every moment of it is really, that's part of the state of being asleep.
But you become very grateful when you see that.
Yes, that's an important part of becoming present and living in the present moment, there is a gratefulness that arises, which is an appreciation of even the simple things that the mind would tell you are not important, even to appreciate a simple object, or look at something that may not be remarkable, but appreciate it because it's life and it has its own beauty. Sometimes people have to take a drug to shut off their mind, and then suddenly they look at a teapot and they say, "Wow, that's amazing." And that can be a good thing. Do it if you do it just once and don't become dependent on that.
The same with falling in love. You don't fall in love with another person, but with the world.
Yes. It's love. I wouldn't call it fall in love, because you fall in love, you become more unconscious. You're falling. But loving, to have a loving relationship with the world. There was one spiritual teacher, Byron Katie, who wrote a book called Loving What Is. So to love just the isness of life at this moment, the richness of it. That's really how life can be when you get out of the narrow little me and realize that you are consciousness. And so that's the formless. Once you know yourself as the formless, then you can actually enjoy the life of forms, because every form is a temporary manifestation of the deeper, the underlying one formless life that you are. So you're actually enjoying yourself, really, in whatever you're looking at. You're enjoying yourself.
Because you are the world.
You are that, yes. And so the division that we see between this is me and there's the rest of the universe, that's of course totally false, total illusion. There's a continuity between you and the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself at this moment through this form, and through this form experiencing other forms. And the universe loves that. And so when you become aligned with that, then you begin to enjoy life deeply. And life becomes easier. It's no longer a burden.
Non-duality.
Yes, non-duality, that's right. Duality easily creeps back in the moment we use language. So many people think of themselves, they say, I don't have a good life. They say, my life. But that creates a duality that isn't actually there. When you say my life, what you're implying is, here's you, and that you have life. But you and life are the same thing. You cannot be separate from life and say, I have a life. The I is life.
There starts the separation.
Yes. The moment you use language, very easily, then separation starts. And you can only keep out of that delusion when you don't believe in all the thoughts that continuously arise. You can still use language, but you realize there is a reality that is deeper than language, and that's nothing to do with words. It's to do with the presence that you are, that is always there, the light behind the words, right now.
I'm chatting with myself now.
Yes. The voice that you're hearing appears in consciousness. That's what it is. It appears in this consciousness, and that consciousness, ultimately the one consciousness.
So life cannot be captured in any way. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to capture moments, capture life, take pictures.
Yes, it's the flow of life, and the mind tries to also capture it by pronouncing judgments continuously on life, interpretations, judgments. This is how it is.
Or should be.
Or sure, even more, yes. This is how it should be, or how you should be, or I should be, or should have been, and so on. So that makes life very complicated. Without that, allowing life to be, it doesn't mean you are condemned to inactivity, but not believing in all the judgments of your mind and then after a while actually being able to go through this world without the judgments, just as a presence. So what is really happening here in the spiritual awakening, if we could call it that, is what grows in you, so to speak, what comes out more is the awareness or the presence, and what becomes less important is the person, which consists of thought forms. So there's a shift from being a person, a little me, to being the awareness behind. And then you can predominantly be the awareness in daily life also, rather than just the little me. And then you become a much more peaceful energy field in this world. You emanate peace, and everything changes. The way in which you experience reality changes, relationships change, conflict, which otherwise is always there, also disappears from your life. You don't have enemies anymore. You don't need them.
So ultimately, the now is a pointer. It's not something to believe in, like go ahead, daily business, and think, oh, I have to be in the now, I have to be in the now.
No, the now is the opening. It's helpful to realize that your entire life consists of now. It has never been not now, nor will it ever not be now. So your life, or just life, and now are really inseparable. And if you look deeply what now is, because most people seem to think that now is what happens in the now, that of course changes continuously. And because people think that the now is what happens in the now, they think there are many different nows, one moment and another moment and another moment. But really, it's always this moment. And because the now is deeper than what happens in the now. And if you go deeply into the now and you can actually feel what that means, the now, this moment, can you sense the reality of this moment? And then you realize what that actually is. It's consciousness itself. The now is the light of consciousness. Of course, that's all there is. And that's who you are, in essence. And that's an enormous liberation. I'm not the person I thought I was. That person can still operate as something within the huge space, but you're no longer reduced to that.
So building self-confidence is an illusion.
Yes, self-confidence in the sense that the ego conceives it. For example, it does that by telling itself, I'm really good enough, or I'm better than most, or it can be a temporary help, but maybe a little better than telling yourself that you are the worst of all human beings. But ultimately, that's not it. It's actually experiencing the power that is in you that transcends the person. And that's what Jesus pointed to when he told the people who were listening to him, you are the light of the world. He is pointing to the power that is in every human being that far transcends the temporary little person. And if you touch that power and realize that's who you are, that's where true self-confidence arises. It's not comparative self-confidence that says, oh, I'm happy because I'm much better off than that other person. That's how the ego tries to build up its confidence. Or the ego says, oh, I really should be happy. Look how miserable these people are. And so if you can only be happy by looking at others who are not happy, that's not so good.
But that's why we watch the news all the time.
Yes, probably, yes.
Or soap series and stuff like that.
Yes. So the real self-confidence is not because you compare yourself to somebody else and then you find that you are better than, but it comes from a power that is a universal power that is not, requires no comparison. In fact, the opposite is true. You realize suddenly that that very power is also the essence of every other human being, even if they don't know it.
So the ego likes to use time to reinforce itself, or?
Yes, time is the big thing that the ego says. First of all, it needs it because by remembering the past, it has some kind of identity. My past, my personal stories becomes my identity. And then it needs the future because the identity that is derived from the past is not satisfying. It doesn't complete me. It might actually be very unsatisfying. And so the ego looks to the future, the next moment, the one after that, hoping to find some kind of fulfillment there. Completion, fulfillment, happiness. One day, when this or that happens, I'll be fine. I just need to find the ideal partner. I just need more money. Whatever it is, one day, and then, of course, the day never really comes, because you may find what you think is the ideal partner until you start living together, and then you realize there is no such thing as an ideal partner. There's only another human being with an ego.
Okay, very nice. Final question. I just dropped out of my mind. Anything you want to ask?
Is it confusing for the people who listen to you? Most spiritual teachers have got methods or things the ego can grab. But I've listened yesterday. I really loved it. There's not, you can only point to it because you cannot grab it. I think that is hard for a lot of people, isn't it?
Yes, yes. The methods, people love methods or techniques, or lots of information that they can write down and take home. But sometimes I wouldn't say discard all methods, but in this teaching, I don't put the emphasis on methods except for little things. I might say, feel the inner body, but it's really too simple to be called a technique or a method. Sometimes, or quite often, a technique or method can come in between you and who you essentially are, because then you think, I need this method in order to arrive at who I am. And usually a technique or method gives you time. Just a few years of meditation, and then you will find out who you are. But of course, that in itself is the last barrier. That only works when you suddenly realize, no, time cannot give me the answer of who I am. It's the present moment. So eventually, of course, every technique has to be let go of, because every technique is, like the Buddha said, it's the raft that you use to cross a river. And once you've crossed a river, you wouldn't carry the raft around with you. Yeah. So this teaching is essentially methodless. It directly points to the truth of who you are. And if there's an opening in you, then the who you truly are can recognize the truth of this, and then that's how it works, really. It's pointing to the truth directly, similar to Zen in a way, because the origin of Zen also was not a method at all. It was, as it said in Zen, direct pointing to the heart without any reference to scriptures or anything else. And over the centuries, Zen itself became a method too. That's what usually happens. But hopefully the power of now will not become a method.
So this is it?
Yes, this is it. And when you asked one more question just now, you couldn't think of one, and of course that's a good thing.
Thank you very much.